Well, thank you all for tuning in to the lecture this week. I believe you will find this topic to be very modern and relevant. It may be a little bit of a different take and a deeper dive than what you've actually done on the history of citizenship before. The idea of this presentation, with all of the contentious issues in society today, the goal is not to persuade you one way or the other. It's really just to present the history so that you are familiar with it. We're going to talk about legislation. We're going to explore some quotes from the founders and then look at some of the modern questions facing American citizenship. And hopefully, by the end of this presentation, you will have developed a pretty solid worldview, whatever you believe on whichever side of the aisle you fall, that's based on knowledge and understanding versus maybe a blurb that you've heard here or something that you've heard there. You've actually been well educated on the topic. And so that's the purpose of this lecture as it relates to political science. So let's dig in and kind of explore. So, e pluribus unum is a phrase that you may or may not be familiar with. Hopefully, it rings a bell. It's on our coins. And so, if you've ever paid attention to what our coins say, and it basically just means one from many. We are one nation made up from many other nations. And so, we are all immigrants at heart in a lot of ways. That was why it was placed on our coins to begin with. So I'm going to start with the tie that binds speech that Lincoln gave in Chicago. And we'll just kind of take this apart. So America has had a long and generous tradition of welcoming as equal citizens a large number of immigrants from a greater variety of national and religious origins. I mean, that's just a historical fact. You look at Ellis Island. I took my family. We toured New York. We went to the Statue of Liberty, toured Ellis Island, and all the things. And many people came through there. Now, another place that's lesser known is Angel Island over on the West Coast. And you have a lot of Asians who came through that particular spot. You can tour it today. You can get a combo ticket, or could. I don't know what they're doing with all this now, but you could get a combo ticket for Alcatraz and Angel Island. And a lot of the Chinese immigrants who went through Angel Island, which is basically like the Ellis Island of the West, they carved their stories on the walls. And so you can take a tour, hear those stories, and some of them had to wait a very long time to be released. I mean, when you talk about the history of America in sort of a quote racist way, I mean, we were favorable to the white people, and that's just sort of a fact. We wanted a cohesive society, and they were a little bit skeptical about letting Asians in for a number of reasons. For one, they would do labor in a cheaper way. And so then it was taking away jobs from other people, and especially on the Transcontinental Railroad and things like that. So that's just a known fact. But again, we're going to explore some other issues and really get into the heart of this. So stay with me, just hang in there and listen to everything else. Get to the end of this presentation before you make a decision. So, so America has had a long history of welcoming immigrants. Shortly before the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln gave a beautiful speech in Chicago. It's called The Tie That Binds Speech. And he said, there's a tie that binds American citizens together and it makes them one. So he says in the speech, if they look back through this history to trace their connection to those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And there's a real question about that word, right? Equal. What does that mean? What did it mean when it was written, and what does it mean today? And so then they feel that the moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, and that they have the right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote the Declaration. And so they are. And I hope you can kind of see where he's going with that. Basically, we don't have blood ties to the founders. Most of us don't. We're all from a lot of different places, diverse backgrounds. But he's saying that if you love liberty the way the founders did, that you have a claim in what they work towards. If you love America, if you love the principles that the founders based it on, then you have ties to them. And maybe you feel that you don't have ties to them. I think the word equal, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Equal had a different meaning. Our founders were trying to balance Enlightenment ideology with cultural norms, and it took them a while to realize that slavery really did not align. And so, there are differences in the way that we see justice today versus how they saw justice then. However, there's a liberty in this country that is unmatched. We are, quote, the free world. And so, if you love that liberty, if you love your free speech, all the freedoms that you receive in the Bill of Rights, you have ties to the founders in those ways. That's sort of what he's saying, blood of the blood, right? Can we be blood of the blood just in ideology alone? And so he goes on to say that this is the electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty loving men together. That we will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. So let's take a look at the history of immigration before I get into the quotes from the founders. The United States has always set limits on immigration or naturalization. Until 1870, only whites were eligible for citizenship, and almost all immigration came from Northern and Western Europe. So, after the huge 1880 to 1914 immigration wave, of which Southern and Eastern Europeans made up a large population, numbers were kept relatively low by the restrictive immigration legislation of the 1920s. And you can kind of see this on the map here, where it's got it categorized by nation of origin, and you can see Cuba is in the red. That's somewhere around 1920s. It picks up, it kind of wanes, and then you get into 1990s. You got a huge wave here. Anyway, but you guys can kind of pause and look over this map if you want. But the 1965 Immigration Act tremendously increased the numbers and changed the source of immigrants. So this law, this law in effect made it harder for Europeans and easier for non-Europeans to come to America. So between 1990 and 94, over 1.2 million people per year, that 80% of them non-Europeans, immigrated to the United States. And this doesn't include the 275,000 or more who enter and remain illegally each year. And in 1997, the government estimated that there were 5 million immigrants residing in the United States in violation of the law. So the idea of, quote, illegal immigration or undocumented migrants, whatever you want to call them, it's been going on for a long time. And there's a real question of how to handle this issue and, how to legislate fairly. Okay, so now we'll get into the quote. So really think about, the founders' views on immigration. And the question here is, first of all, can you identify what they believed, right? What did they actually understand about immigration? Do you agree with their views, or have their views become outdated in modern society? How should we look at this? So let me just read through the quotes and get you guys a good idea. So George Washington frequently commented on immigration and citizenship. It was normal for him. His approach was shared by most of the founding generation, and his plan had two main features. So, first, he said that America should generously welcome as equal citizens people from many nations and religions. And second, the numbers and kinds of immigrants may need to be limited with a view to the qualities of character required for democratic citizenship. So, in other words, he's looking at who they are, not necessarily the country where they came from, although, the founders understood certain countries to have quintessential characteristics, right? Defining features. But he's saying, let's look at what sort of character the individual person has, and if they'll add to the country, we will admit them. And so he wrote in a letter to the Newport Jews. And keep in mind, if you've watched my videos on Jewish history, um, that this is that Jews were not typically accepted into society, and it was really America and maybe the Dutch Republic as well that really adopted them in and gave them not so much equal footing, but at least respect. And so Washington wrote to them, he said, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions." And so Washington's letter shows that he thought America was different from other countries because its government protected, quote, inherent natural rights of all human beings. That includes Jews. For the first time since ancient Israel, Jews could become full citizens of a political community. Normally, they were not granted citizenship. Sometimes they weren't even allowed to have their own cemeteries, or just basic assimilation into society was often very uncommon. And so Washington was more concerned about the character of the people immigrating than he was their racial or religious background. Benjamin Franklin worried about the problem of immigrant numbers as an obstacle to assimilation in the 1750s when he saw a large number of German settlers threatening to transform the character of Pennsylvania. And so he said specifically, "Those who come hither are generally of the most ignorant sort of their own nation. Not being used to liberty, they know not how to make a modest use of it. In elections, they come in droves and carry all before them, except in one or two countries. In short, unless the stream of their importation could be turned from this to other colonies, they will soon outnumber us. That all the advantages we have will not, in my opinion, be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious. Yet I am not for refusing entirely to admit them into our colonies. All that seems to be necessary is to distribute them equally, mix them with the English, establish English schools where they are now too thick settled." And so the idea here is that, I mean, I think you guys can probably infer what he's saying. He wants them to assimilate into English society. And so, in other words, people who are coming from Germany are going to essentially have to become very English to live in America. And I think that's just sort of the character of the country that, we're founded on British colonization. And, we weren't, the 13 colonies were not founded by Spain or France or Germany or, other countries from Europe. We are uniquely British. And so they wanted it to have sort of a uniquely British character. But then there was also this idea that we were distinct from the British and that we had an understanding of liberty that the British did not. And most people in Europe had never experienced democracy. Everyone lived under the monarchy at the time. And so when he says that they're the ignorant sort of their own nation, not being used to liberty, he's saying they don't know what a constitution is. They don't know what it looks like. They don't know what it means to have a Bill of Rights. And so we've got to train them on what liberty looks like. And then he also says that we have to assimilate them, like he wants them to speak the English language. Today we call that, the English speaking world is the Anglosphere. And that goes back to the history of England because when it started, that was called Angleland after the Angles. If you know anything about all of that, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes populated England, and so it was known as Angleland. And eventually, that A became an E. So anyway, so that's fun little historical fact there. But you can see where he's going and assimilating everyone into society and teaching them about liberty. Okay, so as it happened, restrictions on immigration from Europe did not become necessary. War between Britain and France greatly reduced the influx, and the German population stabilized at about 1/3 of Pennsylvania. Now, that's except for the Amish. And of course, you guys know about the Amish communities. Those numbers were too small to affect the character of the state, and they gradually took on the ways of the English speaking majority. The Amish branched off of Menno Simons and the Mennonites. And so if you look back at the Reformation and how all that kind of went down, that again, they did become very English. And so um, Franklin spoke of immigration again in a pamphlet. This is called Information to Those Who Would Remove America. And when Jefferson was an ambassador to France in the late 1780s, he showed his approval of Franklin's pamphlet by reprinting and distributing it. So America had evidently gotten a reputation. So the Europeans like to call us lubberland, and they said America is the land of labor, and by no means should it be called lubberland. So it's almost like people who don't work. Like everything is so easy here. Is that was sort of the European view of America at the time, and so they wanted to make sure that we had a hard work ethic, and that we kind of lost that reputation pretty quickly. And so then that brings us to Madison. What about Madison? What did he say? So, um, similar to Washington and Franklin, in a speech in the first Congress of 1790, James Madison welcomed immigrants to citizenship, but he believed it was necessary to guard against abuses. They should induce the worthy of mankind to come, the object being to increase the wealth and strength of the country. Those who would weaken it were not wanted. And so he said, we are to expect to a greater number of immigrants. And again, keep in mind, this is spelling from the time period as well. It's direct quote. And they will bring with them the principles of the governments they leave, imbibed in their early youth, or if able to throw them off, it will be in exchange for an unbound licentiousness passing, as is usual, from one extreme to another. It would be a miracle were they to stop precisely at the point of temperate liberty. These principles, with their language, they will transmit to their children. In proportion to their numbers, they will share with us the legislation. They will infuse into their spirit and warp and bias its direction, and render it as a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass. So you can see here, he says it much more eloquently, but basically, will it corrupt liberty? Will it corrupt democracy if we let those in who have never experienced it before? So you can kind of see that same question coming out of Jefferson. Um, then there's Hamilton. Hamilton said the safety of a republic depends essentially on the energy of a common nationalist sentiment, on a uniformity of principles and habits, on the exemption of its citizens from foreign bias and prejudice, and on the love of country, which will almost invariably be found to be closely connected with birth, education, and family. And so you can kind of see where he's going here as well. He's talking about uniformity and what that's going to look like, cultural cohesiveness, right? And the opinion advanced in Notes on Virginia is undoubtedly correct that foreigners will generally be apt to bring with them attachments to the persons they have left behind. And that's true. I mean, when we look at the names of our states, New Jersey, New York, New Hampshire, the reason they're called New something is because these are names of places in England. And when the people came over here, they wanted it to be sort of like home, but in a different way. So they called it New whatever, wherever they were from. And it's the same when you're looking at all the immigrants who come over. If they have the ability to name a place, it wouldn't be surprising if they named it something similar to the place that they left, but almost like perfecting it and making sort of like a utopian society in their mind, of making it what they want it to be. And so he says also they will entertain opinions on government congenial with those under which they have lived. Or if they should be led hither from a preference to ours, how extremely unlikely is it that they will bring with them the temperate love of liberty so essential to real republicanism? So again, you see this running theme in all the founders' quotes. They're very concerned about liberty. And you can understand that when you think about them living under the monarchy and feeling oppressed, sort of like the Enlightenment thinkers who said man is born free and everywhere he's in chains. They're feeling chained by the government, chained by the monarchy. And here they have created this government to get away from that, to get out from under that. And they are very concerned that someone is going to come in and threaten that. And they feel a strong need to protect the liberty that they just fought so hard to create through the Declaration of Independence, through the Constitution. So Hamilton Jefferson was Jefferson was argued that real republicanism based on the Declaration on the unalienable rights held equally by all can only be sustained by a temperate love of liberty. This requires that immigrants leave behind their foreign biases and prejudice, Republican opinions on government, and Republican habits of moderation. So, in other words, he's saying that we're doing it differently here in America. Even if they come, there weren't a lot of republics at the time. Like I said, the Dutch Republic actually was quite an efficient government. It thrived, and the Dutch, they populated Amsterdam, which became New York, and all of those things. But what he's saying here is that it's going to be different in our country, and if they want to come here, that's fine, but they're going to have to adhere to our values, kind of thing. So, what principles can you draw from these points? What are you thinking so far about all of this information? Are you in agreement? I guess the question is, do you understand where they're coming from? And then there's the question of, do you agree based on where we're at today in modern society, right? And so here's a few ideas. None of the founders gave a theoretical account of the right of a political community to exclude immigrants. This is because such a right was obvious as to an inference, the general principles they all shared. No one in the early debates in Congress on naturalization laws doubted the government's right to determine exclusionary criteria for citizenship. It's possible, however, to understand the principled basis of the founders' understanding by reflecting on the equality principle announced in the Declaration of Independence and in the Declarations of Rights in several early state constitutions. So, in other words, we wouldn't be a land of liberty if we limited immigration. That would actually be sort of an oxymoron, right? And you know what that means? It's like two things that are opposite. It wouldn't make sense for us to say we're a land of liberty and then not allow immigrants to come in. However, do we have the right to exclude whom we wish and accept whom we wish? And is that in itself an infringement on liberty? And those are also real questions that the founders grappled with, and we still have to grapple with today. Okay, so today it is frequently said that it's wrong to deny foreigners the blessing of American liberty. And so, what I'm going to do now is just go through a couple of modern quotes and modern views. And again, not taking a side, but these are just it's sort of like an opposing viewpoints part of the presentation, right? So, it's frequently said that it's wrong to deny foreigners the blessings of American liberty. And so this man, Roger Mahoney, he's a Catholic cardinal of LA, he said that the right to immigrate is more fundamental than that of nations to control their borders. The founders would answer to that the purpose of government is to secure the rights of the people, that is, the citizens, the people who form the government. And when the government fails to secure the rights of the people, it is their right and duty to, quote, alter or abolish it for the sake of their safety and happiness. And so, again, there's a real question here. What are the rights of citizens? What are the rights of foreigners? And where do we draw the line? Now, the counter argument to Mahoney, Thomas West, he speaks for Hillsdale College and a lot of conservative groups. He says to say that there is a fundamental right to immigrate is as much to say that the government of one country is obliged to secure the rights of every person in the world who presents himself and demands it. Such an obligation is by nature both impossible and unjust. It is a violation of the liberty of a people to live with those they choose to associate with, therefore, a violation of the fundamental terms of the social compact. The founders' understanding, in the founders' understanding, Americans are no more responsible for securing the rights of Mexicans and Haitians than Mexicans and Haitians are for securing the rights of Americans. Each people must undertake the task of securing its natural rights by and for itself. And so that's a real question. Are we looking at the issue of humanity in general, or are we looking at this from a legislative view, a political view that says there are borders and boundaries and we shouldn't cross these things? And if our people decided to go to their country, should they be accepted in with open arms, no questions asked? What we're doing for them, would they do for us, kind of thing. Okay, so he goes on to say that this does not mean that Americans may treat foreigners unjustly. All human beings have a right to be free. But the wrong habits and beliefs can make a particular people at a particular time incapable of freedom. Since those who lack the qualities of Republican citizenship cannot be safe, quote, guardians of their own liberty, a free society should regulate the admission of new citizens with a view to the danger that they might pose to liberty to the extent that they have not yet acquired the political principles and minimal morality of freedom. And so you can kind of see in these quotes, both from Mahoney and West, the two sides and the two arguments, which both have valid points. I mean, they both have valid points. And there's a real question here, I guess, of what is more essential and what is beneficial for all people. What does the Constitution say? So, aside from what our own personal opinion is, how is it legislated? And I think that's really the biggest thing when we're looking at American government. Remember, the highest power in the land, as set by the founders, is not a person, it's a document. And our leaders are supposed to follow the Constitution. And, the Constitution was written to be broad and vague on purpose so that it would last through multiple generations. Thomas Jefferson actually suggested that we rewrite it about every 20 years to make up for generational differences. And, he actually wasn't present at the drafting of the Constitution. He was away in France writing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen during the French Revolution. So it's kind of interesting he wasn't able to weigh in on that, but they wrote it to be broad and vague on purpose. And so I put the entire Article 1, Section 8. As you can see, this covers a lot of different issues. I put in bold, this is all it says about naturalization: to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So what does that look like? Well, that's that's your backbone to work with, and then you can make that look however you want through over the course of time. And in a way, it was very wise of the founders to list it like that, because it does leave a lot of wiggle room and a lot of freedom as we go through all of the years since it was written. Well, what else does the Constitution say? What about the 14th Amendment? It says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So remember the context of the 14th Amendment. It was put in after the Civil War. American-born children of immigrants began to be granted automatic citizenship as a result of the 14th Amendment, because it says all persons born in the U.S. And subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. So those who came to America knew that if they didn't become citizens, their children would. And so therefore, naturalization gradually became less important as a means to regulate immigration. And the first federal law limiting immigration was the Chinese Exclusion Act that was passed in 1882. Okay, so it appears, however, that the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment may have been misunderstood. Edward J. Erler points out that the author of the clause, Senator Jacob Howard, emphatically stated that those who were subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners or aliens. So, but it doesn't read like that, right? So they didn't put that in the verbiage, and it makes it a little bit ambiguous. And so, in other words, the 14th Amendment was never intended to grant automatic citizenship to American-born children of foreigners, and the Supreme Court erred in 1898 when it ruled otherwise. So that brings us to DACA. So what is DACA? Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This was created by Obama in 2012 when he asked DHS to grant a 2-year amnesty to illegal immigrants who arrived in the United States before their 16th birthday, if they had resided in the U.S. since June 15, 2007, and were under the age of 31 as of June 2012. So this amnesty included work authorization and advance parole. Advanced parole allows an illegal alien to apply for permission to leave the U.S. and return. And so, as you can imagine, this benefit became a loophole that allowed illegals to leave the country and then be admitted back in. And so they could then apply for a green card. So you can kind of see how that works based on the wording. Notice how specifically he implemented that. And so there's a real question here. Are these changes constitutional? Do they align with the original intent of the founders? I'll let you guys ponder that. All right, so more history. So there's a huge immigration wave from 1880 to 1914. So we're in what's called the Progressive Era, kind of like the tail end of the Gilded Age, getting into the Progressive Era. All of a sudden, you have all this immigration happening. And so there's a series of laws culminating in the Immigration Act of 1924. They limit total immigration to 150,000 per year, and the actual numbers were usually much less than that. Between 1881 and 1920, annual immigration had averaged about 600,000. So each country was assigned a quota in proportion to its percentage of the American population in 1890. Northern and Western Europe received 82% of the quota, Southern and Eastern Europe 16%, and that left 2% for the rest of the world. The last national origin provisions of American immigration laws were repealed in 1965, and of course that was because of the Civil Rights Movement. So today, the history of exclusion by race and national origin in immigration and naturalization law is considered sort of an embarrassment and an injustice. But if we consider this earlier law charitably, we can see that Americans were struggling with real problems. And so what was the major problem? Why would they even implement laws like that? Well, does it go back to the founders? How do you maintain a population with moral and religious qualities to keep itself free? So, how do you preserve liberty, but how do you be fair to everyone? And again, it does go back to, I think Franklin probably is the closest, where he's talking about, he wants this European cohesiveness, that you want them to speak the same language, you want them to have the same values, to have the same understanding. And so again, there's sort of an idea of cohesiveness among the founders, which then actually did lead to exclusion of certain groups and minorities. Now, there is a real link between democracy and morality, and that's not just wishful thinking. That's like a real principle in political science. And there's a book called Jesus in Beijing by David Aikman, but he talks about the Chinese and how they did a lot of research on America and what makes us such a strong country. Like, why have we been a leader in the world for all this time? Well, he says that one of the things that we were asked to look into, and this is a quote from a Chinese political analyst. So this Chinese analyst, he says, one of the things that we were asked to look into was what accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminence of the West all over the world. He says, we studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspectives. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. And then we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is your religion, Christianity. This is why the West is so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and then the successful transition to democratic politics. We do not have any doubt about this. And so that's a very interesting perspective. Even if you're not a Christian, if you don't believe in the Bible, if you have another faith, or maybe you're atheist, I don't know what your stance is, but historically speaking, it's true that, America was founded on Protestantism. And we are the only nation that was actually founded on Protestantism. Other nations converted, from Catholicism or whatnot, but we really were founded on Protestant values. And you can see that coming out in the founders' quotes. And it's really, there really is, even like the Noahide laws. When you look at global government, there's a discussion of making the 7 laws of Noah a basis for all humanity, because they're just so generalized and easy for everyone to follow. And so there is something about the Bible as a moral structure, a moral foundation, And that's kind of what he's saying here, is that because of our religion, we had this moral foundation, which then led into all these other things. And so they're looking at like, what was the source, right? What was the catalyst? What's the catalyst for the economic system of capitalism? What's the catalyst for democracy? And they boil it down to Christianity is the catalyst for all these things. So, and again, that's also, part of the immigration situation here. The views on immigration are all linked to these things as well. And so when Americans used rough categories like national origin to determine who should be eligible for entry or citizenship, they didn't believe that every member of a given nation was perfectly suited or unsuited for citizenship. They were far from believing that every white man was virtuous or every black or Indian or Asian was vicious. They resorted to these categories because many characteristics shared, and some, not all, of a given group could possibly hinder Republican qualities of self control and ideals of liberty. And so, what this is basically saying is there really are cultural norms within each country. And for those who want to come here, they're going to have to assimilate into certain values and a certain framework in order to become American citizens. And again, notions of justice have changed over time. And so we see this differently, especially post the civil rights era. So, from the standpoint of the founders' principles, the perfect immigration policy would judge people as individuals, not as groups. And that's kind of the idea. I think the the idea that you limit by percentages sort of does judge people as groups. I don't think there's a whole lot of pushback against that. But at the same time, you want to look at each individual person and admit them based on their own personal beliefs and understanding. And so it would be based on the knowledge of the moral and political habits and attitudes of every person who might wish to enter and become an American citizen. All right, so that we're getting down to the tail end of this here, and so I'm going to finish it up by asking the question: is America a melting pot or a salad bowl? And this may be a question you've heard of before. They've talked about this on NPR and I mean all kinds of places. And so, what does this actually mean, right? The phrase melting pot was popularized by a 1908 play called The Melting Pot by Israel Zangwill, and he's a British Jewish writer. And so in the play, a Russian Jewish immigrant falls in love with a Christian woman, and the story emphasizes the idea of America as a place where different ethnicities and cultures blend into one harmonious whole. And so that's actually an assignment that my history students have. I asked them to evaluate liberty in marriage indicates the liberty of a nation, and some of that is cultural norms as well. But if you're free to marry whoever you want, that says a lot about how that country thinks and sees other people groups, right? And so that's kind of what you see here. Now, the salad bowl model emphasizes multiculturalism, diversity, and the coexistence of distinct cultural identities within a society. And so the salad bowl model does relate to critical theory. And I think that this is just sort of it's getting to be a well-known fact as we are studying issues related to diversity in our society today, and people are looking more into it and becoming more educated. I am going to spend these last few slides just kind of explaining what this is. These are probably words that you've heard, like CRT, like maybe you don't know critical theory quite as well, but you've heard CRT, you've heard DEI, and I'm going to try to like unpack that for you. So basically, critical theory is so critical race theory, CRT, which you're probably familiar with. It's under the umbrella of critical theory, but critical theory comes out of a historical school of interpretation. It's called the Frankfurt School, and revisionist history also comes out of that, especially how these frameworks question dominant narratives and change traditional assimilationist views like the melting pot. So basically, the melting pot would be the founder's view, and the salad bowl is sort of like the post civil rights era view. Okay, so it's challenging the original interpretation. And so, if you want to read more on this, you can see Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodore Adorno. And, I've got a couple of other book suggestions here as well. There's one that's even better than that one. Herbert Marcuse is sort of the founder of critical theory in a lot of ways. I encourage you to start with him. He was one of the most influential. He wrote a book called The One Dimensional Man. Marcuse was a German American philosopher. He was a sociologist. He was a member of the Frankfurt School, and he played a key role in expanding, radicalizing, and popularizing critical theory, especially during the 1960s. All right, so what is revisionism? What is revisionist history? Well, historical revisionism re-examines and often challenges dominant historical narratives. So in other words, like when you're looking at history, there's a lot of different schools of interpretation and there are a lot of different views. But if you wanted to boil it down into like three main categories, and this is like way oversimplifying it, but you could talk about originalism, right? The originalist view is usually like a nationalist view. People who love their countries, they will write a pro whatever history, so pro United States history. If I'm from Russia, and I'm an originalist, I'd probably write a pro-Russian history, which may not be so favorable to the US, right? If I'm from China, same thing. Spain, I mean, whatever it is. And so that's an originalist interpretation. It's typically a nationalist view. Well, then you've got revisionism comes along and it sort of challenges these narratives by saying, okay, so let's try not to be biased and let's look at what's positive and what's negative. But revisionism is often, it can also be biased because it points the finger and kind of like highlights all the ills of society to combat the nationalist view, to point out to the nationalists, hey, you guys missed these things, right? You guys didn't get this stuff. So I'm going to make sure. Well, then you have what's known as post revisionism. And so, so you got the nationalist view, pro nation, you got the revisionist view, hey, look at what you guys left out. Then you've got post revisionism that really tries to take both those and synthesize it together and present, hopefully, a more fair and balanced view. And so revisionism is often driven by post-colonial, feminist, racial justice, or indigenous perspectives. The salad bowl is a revisionist interpretation. It challenges traditional Eurocentric conceptions of American identity. Instead of telling a singular story of assimilation, it elevates the contributions and struggles of diverse groups. It encourages rewriting history to include multiple perspectives, not just that of the dominant group. And so I feel like I've really explained this pretty well. But if you get like Howard Zinn's History of the American People is a classic quintessential revisionist text. There are many others. The Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Teacher Got Wrong, things like that. So you can kind of see where this is going. Other revisionist works are here. You guys can pause if you want to look these up and read them. And so finally, today's America. Today's America really is more like a salad bowl. Multiculturalism is celebrated in a lot of ways. You have dual language education, ethnic enclaves are common. Citizens are encouraged to retain and express their heritage. And that's the issue, with cultural heritage. There is a real question of, what's more essential. And remember, I said at the beginning of this, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but hopefully get you to think critically about these issues so that you do understand what you believe. And so what's more important? Is it more important to be a melting pot where we have civic cohesiveness, or is it more important to be a salad bowl where we celebrate cultural differences while still living together? And so, in the founder's vision, America was closer to a melting pot. It was a place where immigrants were expected to adopt a unified national identity rooted in shared values and political principles. George Washington, here's another little quote, we'll end on this. By an intermixture with our people, they or their descendants get assimilated to our customs, measures, and laws. In a word, soon to become one people. And they saw unity as essential for the survival of the new republic. Now, contextualize this with history, right? So if you had just fought in the American Revolution, If you're living at a time where society is changing, it's shifting, the monarchy is ending, democracy is going to become the new form of government, and you're trying to get your democracy off the ground, was this right for the founders in their time that they wanted to create this unified society with this very English American cultural identity, right? I mean, and that is also, in addition to the other cultural identities that we celebrate, should we also celebrate American cultural identity from its founding? Is that one as well? And if we don't celebrate that, have we incorporated a bias of our own? And that's the thing. If you're going to celebrate cultures, you've got to celebrate them all and not point the finger at any. And that can be very difficult to do. So the founders saw unity as an essential for survival of the new republic. They were not entirely opposed to immigration. They believed that newcomers should adopt American principles, particularly the ideals of liberty, republicanism, and individual responsibility. Their focus was less on cultural diversity and more on civic cohesion. And so you can kind of see these two different views. I hope now that we've gone through all this information, you guys have a good footing. I encourage you to go back, look up some of this legislation related to immigration. I mean, look up, there's even more than what I've shared. Reagan has some. I encourage you to look up a timeline of American immigration. Make sure you have a good understanding of what it looked like at the founding, how it changed and grew, especially in relation to certain cultural movements, and then how we see it today. And hopefully that will help you as you develop your own personal worldview about citizenship and immigration, as based on historical fact and good understanding of American history. So thank you for watching.